And this largesse in advertising dollars is both a taxpayer bailout of CanWest Global, CBC, and CTV television. It serves as a bribe to the corporate media to mute its criticism of the Tory government. Criticized too loudly and the rich flow of government advertising stops coming at a time when private businesses have dramatically reduced their advertising on television. Now, $20 billion of the $30 billion in stimulus spending in this canned pork product is actually tax credits for business and individuals. Now, the most popular of all these tax credits is the home renovation tax credit. So if you fix up your old home, you could get up to $4,500 refunded off your income taxes. Now, who tends to vote conservative in elections? I'll tell you who: rural homeowners. Renters, students, urban condominium owners whose new property requires few upgrades, and single people and couples without children, well, they tend to vote NDP, Liberal, or Green. And they cannot use this tax credit nearly as much as families with kids who put a lot of wear and tear on their home, who in the main vote for the Conservatives. And prior to this formalized stimulus spending plan, there was $4 billion alone given to auto plants in Ontario-based auto plants, and that's GM $3 billion and Chrysler $1 billion were doled out earlier this year. Now, businesses that go begging for your tax dollars should be boycotted because they are operating inefficiently, and the marketplace has already rejected them. That is, you, the buyer, the consumer, have rejected them. So they go to government begging for favors, using political influence, blackmail, extortion, the threat of moving out of the country, and various other kind of stratagems. Well, you should not buy a GM or Chrysler vehicle. Ford, Acura, Honda, Kenworth, Opel, Vauxhall, Suzuki, Toyota, Volkswagen, and even Canadian-made Zen all make vehicles here in Canada and are properly run without bailout money and are looking for you to show your support when you buy a car, not through your tax contributions. In the House of Commons, Transport Minister John Baird was aggressively defending the Tory checks that were given out on politically influenced vote buying with the taxpayers' own money. Baird quoted John Chrétien from the 1990s with this quote from the former Liberal Prime Minister. Like I said earlier, Preston Manning must be puking in his porridge to see what reform has become, quoting the Liberal Chrétien for legitimacy. Indeed. Well, said both Chrétien and Baird recently, listen, we are the government. I don't see why we can't try to get credit for what we do. I hope we do so. There's nothing to be ashamed in that. Well, the very vital difference in comparing the Chrétien-Martin era with the Harper president is that the Liberals cut the deficit in every year but 3 while distributing pork. While Preston Manning, prior to 1997 to 2005, the debt was going down. While reform was created precisely because the conservative Mulroney was exploiting the West, incurring annual operating deficits, and focused on delivering pork to the East, Harper is following up that exact same Mulroney roadmap, only way more on steroids. Which brings us to this: government spending under Stephen Harper. You know, the first fiscal budget for the Harper Tories was in 2006, and it was $222 billion. That's the total amount government spent in 2006 of your tax dollars, $222 billion. And in 2009, it has moved up to $259 billion, which is a 17% increase over 4 years. That may not seem much to you, but remember, in the same 4 years, inflation was only 7%. So basically, the government is spending way more than the rate of inflation of your tax money, and you already owe $495 billion of the government debt. Now, another thing the Conservatives promised was accountability and transparency. And the details yet of many government programs are refused by the Harper government. And some of the areas are, for example, they have not divulged the cost of the advertising campaign of Canada's Economic Action Plan. And they have not disclosed the details of the riding-by-riding spending of this pork. And additionally, they don't even disclose the budget details and total annual spending on our military participation in Afghanistan. This was explained by Defense Minister Peter MacKay with the explanation that the numbers were being concealed for the purposes of national security, so that Al-Qaeda and the Taliban would not be able to deduce our strategies and material requirements by perusing the accounting details of the cost of the war. Well, which brings us to the new crime bills that are in Parliament. The new crime bills are estimated to add 5,000 to 7,000 new inmates each year to the prison population. In just 7 years, this will double the prison population from 38,000 inmates to 76,000 inmates. An additional $16 to $20 billion is required for every additional 10,000 inmates serving just 1 year. The Harper government refuses to release the cost estimates because it's scary expensive, let me assure you, even though they admit they have them. The forbidding cost of making our prison sentences longer and expanding the net to add tens of thousands of additional drug offenders while canceling accelerated parole and the 2-for-1 remand credit is a compelling argument in rejecting this new legislation. But the citizens are being kept unaware of the staggering costs of making more prisoners, for absolutely no public benefit, too. These kind of measures have bankrupted the state of California and many other of the states within the United States with large prison populations since they adopted similar measures in the 1980s. For example, a male inmate in a Canadian jail for 1 year costs the taxpayer $101,000, and a female inmate costs $185,000. So just 6 women in a jail for 1 year costs $1 million. Just 10 men in a jail for 1 year costs $1 million. A person growing 10 marijuana plants in a rented home now will receive a minimum 9 months in jail, ruining their life at also a cost of $75,000 to the taxpayer. With the flurry of Tory anti-crime bills, 10 new prisons and remand centers are to be built annually, and private prison companies like Corrections Corporation of America are being invited to run these new prisons. The new Edmonton Remand Center that opened this month in October 2009 cost $640 million to build, and 10 new prisons annually are underway at a cost of $6.5 billion. Now, here's a little bit of the information that's out of the paper today in the Globe and Mail. The Parliamentary Budget Officer, Kevin Page, is launching the first stage of a financial analysis aimed at pinning down the total cost of the Conservative government's tough-on-crime agenda. The preliminary work is being done in response to a written request by Liberal MP Marc Holland. The MP hopes it will determine the financial implications of 3 crime bills already passed into law and 4 others that are still being debated in Parliament. Quote, the government has supplied Parliament with no costing for these policies, despite the fact that the cost to our correctional system will inevitably be in the hundreds of millions of dollars as a significant influx of new federal inmates will result. And the Public Safety Minister, Peter Van Loan, who is responsible for the Correctional Services of Canada, said this month that the government is in fact preparing for more inmates. The service's budget for prison infrastructure has doubled already since 2006 when the Conservatives took office. Mr. Van Loan has said the government has internal estimates showing the expected rise in prison inmates that will be attributed to each new measure, but is declining to make those numbers public. So the flurry of new crime bills, particularly the ones ending 2-for-1 credit for remand, the end of accelerated parole for first-time nonviolent offenders, and Bill C-15 mandatory minimum jail sentence for drug offenses will commit Canada to a fantastic expansion of the inmate population. Canada's prison population has remained static for about 30 years. You know, crime has been decreasing except drug crime for 30 years. There have been 34,000 to 39,000 inmates total in all Canadian detention centers and facilities in any given year from 1979 to 2009. By contrast, the U.S. prison population exploded from 380,000 in 1980 to 2.5 million in 2009, exclusively due to 3 strikes laws, mandatory minimum jail sentences for drug offenses, lengthy sentences, and the elimination of federal parole in the U.S. Yet crime in Canada has continued a downward trend over 30 years, except drug and particularly marijuana-related offenses. Existing Canadian law, by the way, can be severe if a judge chooses to be severe. No new legislation is required to do that. And Justice Minister Attorney General Rob Nicholson could not produce any science or reports to bring these new crime bills as to their legitimacy and to their improving public safety. When asked in committee by MP Libby Davies if he had any science to show that mandatory minimum jail sentences create desirable social benefits, particularly since the U.S. experience has produced only tremendous expense without any corresponding safety, the minister replied, "It's been a long time since we had a number of these mandatory penalties here, and we are absolutely convinced in consultations with Canadians that this is exactly what Canadians want us to do." Well, when pushed again by Libby Davies, NDP MP for Vancouver East, with the question, well, do you have any evidence of that? Do you have any studies that show that? Nicholson responded, "We have evidence that Canadians have told us that, and with respect to resources, I can tell you that this is welcome across the country." If such nonsense sounds awful unscientific, bear in mind that Rob Nicholson was actually the Minister of Science in the Brian Mulroney government from 1989 to 1991, if you want to know how bad things are.